Part 9 of Beyond Good and Evil begins with sections 257 and 258, in which Nietzsche describes the importance and function of aristocracy in the spiritual advance of humanity. All advances in human culture, writes Nietzsche, have been led by aristocratic societies. Spiritual evolution requires a strong order of rank, a key concept in Nietzsche's thought. He explains how the social and the spiritual are linked. The pathos of distance between higher and lower ranks of men, constantly reinforced by practices that keep the noble self aloof and keep the lower orders down, this pathos leads to a similar elevation in the soul. The social and psychological institutions of aristocracy power the human drive to self-overcoming, or self-transcendence. Nietzsche ends this section by dispelling any romantic illusions his readers may have. Aristocratic cultures always begin in violence and subjugation. Barbarians, strong but crude in both culture and spirit, sweep down on peaceful, weak, corrupt, more civilized peoples. But their dominance is not merely physical, but spiritual. They are more fully human in every sense of the word, and thus also more fully beasts. Section 258 describes the conditions of healthy and corrupt aristocracies. For an example of a corrupt aristocracy, Nietzsche cites the nobility of pre-revolutionary France. They threw away their privileges in order to indulge their moral vanity. This was the final act in their centuries-long abasement before the monarchy. By contrast, writes Nietzsche, a healthy aristocracy sees itself not as a function or partner of any other social institution, but rather as the meaning and justification of all other classes and institutions. Thus, a healthy noble class accepts that countless other human beings must, for its sake, be lowered to the status of incomplete human beings, not fully human. They have a fundamental faith that society and other humans exist for them, not they for it. Nietzsche compares them to the sun-seeking vines of Java, which grow up around the tallest trees until they reach the canopy and can unfold their glory in the sun. Here Nietzsche seems to be describing a corporate will to power, the confident strength of will of a noble class to dominate weaker elements in society and to accept the human suffering that domination entails without self-doubt or rational qualms. Section 259 discusses the prospect of a truce or of peace between strong individuals. We can envision a situation in which strength, recognizing strength like itself, might agree to a mutual refraining from injury and aggression. But this standoff peace cannot be made the organizing principle of an entire society, as has been attempted in modern Europe. When it's extended to all of society, it becomes a principle of decay. In this section, Nietzsche gives us a very powerful quote defining the will to power. He says, "Life is essentially appropriation, injury, and overpowering of what is alien and weaker." He employs an organic metaphor. We might observe that in the human body, if it is a living body, the parts of the body cooperate and refrain from mutual injury, but in order for the entire body to live, it must subdue, kill, and eat what is alien to itself, what is outside of itself. It must, Nietzsche says, become an incarnate will to power if it is to live. Modern Europeans resist this truth most of all, Nietzsche says, the truth that exploitation is not a corruption or a degradation of life, it is life itself. Life is will to power. This brings us to the end of section 259. The next section, section 260, will introduce the terms master morality and slave morality. We'll look at that in the next video. Section 260 of Beyond Good and Evil is where we get the famous distinction between master morality and slave morality. This section is important and it's worth reading closely. Master and slave morality, Nietzsche tells us, are two ideal types which we find not isolated, but present in mixture in different historical moral codes and in different individual moral codes. So it may be that a single individual or a religion or nation may have in its morality a combination of master and slave influences. It may have some master moral elements and some slave moral elements to it. The key distinction between these two moral types is the origin of value, how it is that human beings create or assign value to actions and people. Do moral values originate in a ruling group which is conscious of and affirms its distance from those below it, which possesses that pathos of distance which was discussed earlier in Part 9? Or do morals originate from an enslaved or subjugated group? And this is the origin of what Nietzsche will call slave morality. Master morality we'll discuss first. This is the moral valuation pattern that comes from a ruling group, an elite, a conquering elite perhaps, which delights in its pathos of distance, in its external triumph over people who are far beneath it, which embraces and affirms that distance, and in doing so affirms itself in its own typical states, its state of nobility, of confidence, of creativity, of using power to accomplish things. The master moralist then defines these qualities as good meaning then similar to us, we superior ones. So for the good for the master moralist is a kind of self-knowledge and self-affirmation. It is a saying yes to oneself and one's will to power. Bad then is defined as a secondary concept in master morality in opposition to the primary concept of good. Bad is the opposite of the good, so bad would mean not strong but weak, not noble but base, not superior but petty. And so bad people and bad qualities are held in contempt by the master moralist, by master moralizing. Nietzsche notes that in master moralizing at least, moral valuation is applied first to persons and only afterwards to actions, not what we might think is the opposite, where we first say certain actions are good and one who does those actions habitually becomes a good person through doing them. Nietzsche says instead, one is not good because he does good actions. His actions are valued and defined as good because of the value he attaches to himself, because they are the actions of a good man. So Nietzsche says in this part, the noble type of man experiences itself as determining values. It has a self-knowledge of the role of its own will to power in creating and assigning the values and the value categories that it uses. So the master moralist knows itself, knows its will to power as the real source of value in the world. And this is the way in which I think the master moralist is in touch with the truth and is able to say yes to the truth about morality in a way that the slave moralist is in denial. We'll see that later on. Nietzsche tells us that the master moralist has no need for the approval of others, since his morality is generated from within himself, and he has no room for pity in his moral code. Master morality is a morality of self-affirmation, and so it reacts with hostility and irony towards selflessness and altruism, towards goods which we might associate with the dominant historical morality of Christian Europe. The master moralist, though, is also able to practice reverence for tradition and for his ancestors, as those historical forces which made it possible for him to be what he is. Since he values himself, he values his past, he values those to whom he owes this debt of tradition. This is quite in contrast to the valuing of new modern ideas. As we'll see, it's the slavish type of moral valuation which values modern ideas which will come and overturn tradition, which will make things different from the way that they have been. The master moralist feels duties only to his peers. He has no duties to those below him, towards whom he would act with indifference, that is to say, beyond good and evil. The way to think about this may be that the master moralist knows that his morality is of a higher order and simply is not comparable with or commensurable with his treatment of people who are far beneath him at the other end of this pathos of distance. Master moralists are able to practice, Nietzsche says, long gratitude, and long revenge. They are able to stretch out over time both positive and negative reactions, and they also have a need for enemies to define themselves against, to triumph over. Let's turn now to slave morality. Nietzsche says, suppose the violated, the oppressed, the suffering, the unfree, those who are uncertain of themselves and weary, suppose they moralize. What will their moral valuations have in common? I think the key to slave morality is that as human beings, this type of person has no self-possession, and so they moralize from a position of weakness and from a position of psychological passivity. What do their moral valuations have in common? Pessimism, suspicion, and skepticism about the human condition, a general feeling that, on the whole, it's not that good a thing to be human. Being human means suffering. It means enduring what you cannot change. And so it's really not that great. This suspicion is extended especially towards the virtues of the strong, what the strong people call good. And we'll see this emerges in the psychology of resentment, of ressentiment, of the feeling that whatever the strong have, it can't really be that good. It can't really be worth having, really. So there must be some way in which the morality of the strong is a lie, is a deception, is not truly the real source of and nature of value and of goodness. So the slave moralist would like to believe that the strong are not truly happy in their will to power, self-affirmation. There's something deeply wrong with them. What does the slave moralist call good, then? He calls good those qualities which will ease the suffering of the wretched, his own suffering and the suffering of his fellow oppressed peoples. Qualities like compassion, patience, humility, kindness, and pity, and perhaps most of all, pity. Notice what's happening here is that the valuation pattern is that the slave values what qualities the master might possess, which would make life easier for the slave. So Nietzsche says, slave morality is essentially a morality of utility. I might say it's not a morality of creation or of affirmation or of being oneself. It's a morality of getting by, of trying to mitigate the harmful and dangerous influences in one's life. It's a morality of trying to get out from under, even to a slightly greater degree. And it's from this slave moralism that we find the opposition of good and evil. For the slave moralist, the category of evil encompasses all that is powerful, fear-inspiring, cruel, and dangerous. In other words, everything that is the master as seen from the eyes of the oppressed slave. It's not possible for a human being to feel contempt from this position, only fear and hatred and resentment. And I think this is crucial. Nietzsche says eventually, even slave morality's quality of good, the useful, the safe, is eventually viewed with a kind of disdain as simple-minded or foolish. That is, what qualities are most useful to me as a slave in a master ruling over me? The qualities that make the master to be kind of simple-minded and stupid, a kind of goody-two-shoes, pity and the like. And so another quote from Nietzsche from this passage, wherever slave morality becomes preponderant, language tends to bring the words good and stupid closer together. To be good is to be naive. To be good is to not make use of your power. That, of course, is precisely what the slave moralist wants. That's his ideal condition. Rather than a reverence for tradition or one's ancestors and an affirmation of the past, we find instead in slave moral codes a longing for freedom, specifically freedom from the present order, which includes oppression and pain and suffering for the lower orders. I think it's in this sense that we can see slave morality taking humanity towards this ideal of the last man, the one who lives comfortably and safely and well, but has no higher concern. It's the slave moralist who would say to Zarathustra, give us this last man. We want to be the last man. We want to have no more concerns. A one herd and no shepherd, that's what we want. Let's finish this part by thinking about the psychological profiles of the master moralist and the slave moralist. The master moralist thinks and behaves towards the good with a kind of pride and self-affirmation. He is active and creative because in valuing things as good, he is affirming himself and extending the reach of his mind and his psyche out into the world. Towards things the master moralist assigns the value bad, he feels contemptuous or ultimately indifferent. They are of such a vastly lower order from himself and his good that he can afford to ignore them. This, we might say, is the privilege of the master in relation to the slave. The slave, however, can never completely ignore the master, and so we find in slave morality towards what they call evil attitudes of fear, of hate, of seeking to mitigate or escape to achieve a kind of freedom from what the evil would do to us. And then towards good, a kind of welcome, since one really wants the good, one wants safety and release from suffering, but tinged with an element of disdain, a feeling that really what I really need is for the master to be less masterful, to be less good, to be less fully himself. So that brings us to the end of section 260. We'll take a look at the following sections in the next video. In section 261 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche analyzes the phenomenon of vanity, and he begins by trying to look at it from the perspective of the noble personality. When the noble or strong person sees vanity, what does he see? And it seems that vanity will be a kind of a mystery to the strong person. Among the weak and the base, this phenomenon of vanity seems to consist of having a good opinion of yourself despite knowing that it is in no way deserved. It seems to consist in forcing yourself to think better of yourself than you merit, or celebrating other people's praise of you despite its not being earned or justified. To the strong personality, then, vanity seems like a bizarre combination of bad taste, lack of self-respect, a kind of baroque irrationality, so unusual, so strange that the noble spirit might think it is quite rare in the world. Surely, he will say, no large number of people can really force themselves to think this way about themselves. But unfortunately, vanity is all too common in the world, and it provides a helpful contrast for us with the self-valuation and self-worth of the strong, value-creating, noble personality type that was described in the previous section on master morality. The key to unlocking the mystery of vanity, Nietzsche says, is for the noble spirit to realize that throughout history, the common man is only what he is considered to be. That is, his being, his self-worth, comes only from his being perceived and being imposed upon by others. He receives his value and his identity from outside forces, from those who create values, whoever they happen to be at his place and time. Not being a value creator, he cannot find any sort of inner, grounded sense of his own worth. He is something like a value sponge rather than a value creator. This brings up again the contrast between the strong type and the weak type of human personalities, the type that can create values and does so sort of for its own glory and as its own best activity, and the weak type of human personality, which is, I might say, value sterile, which is value receiving, but never value creating. We might even say at its extremes, this weak type of personality is unable even to fathom the prospect of values being created by a person out of his own resources. The weak man cannot, and certainly will not, posit values himself. That's just not something that he is aware of being able to do. He is accustomed then to being told what he is, to receiving his role, to receiving his worth, his value, his place in the world from others. He receives his self-worth from outside of himself by whatever the dominant value-creating force is, whether it's the master for the slave, or society at large for the democratic person living in a democratic age, or perhaps from the church for the Christian, Nietzsche says. Modern democratic European culture, Nietzsche says, is a mixture of these master and slave drives, resulting from a kind of long intermixing of these two different personality types and tribes. And so we find the phenomenon of vanity is the result of the combination of two different drives in the human person. There is this relatively rare, masterful drive among the select elite, the noble persons, to think well of oneself and to think well of one's own, just because it is one's own. This ability to assert value, to create value in the world. In the modern age, this has become widespread. It has, in a certain form, been spread out among the masses, so that everybody wants to think well of himself. Everybody wants to think well of his own tribe, his own nation, his own team. But there is also beneath this, in the common people, Nietzsche says, an older, more slavish instinct, an instinct for submission, this long-trained personality instinct or impulse to submit to the valuations that others express of me. And it's the combination of these two drives that produces the phenomenon of vanity, in which a person welcomes every good opinion of himself, regardless of its truth. Every good opinion he hears of himself pleases him, and every bad opinion of himself that he hears expressed, it pains him, causes him distress. The modern self feels subjected to these opinions just because they have been expressed. And that's because he has this deep sort of instinctive slavish drive to accept what others present to him of his own value and his own worth, this instinct to submit. So Nietzsche writes, it's the slave lingering in the blood of the vain person that seduces him to good opinions of himself. He becomes, as it were, a kind of collector of good opinions about himself. He assembles all these good opinions and then prostrates himself before them, as though he had not himself just now collected them and set them up for his own admiration and edification. And so he concludes this chapter by noting vanity is an atavism. It is a kind of evolutionary leftover. It is the result of some kind of adaptive drive deep in our ancestral past. It remains as a sort of slavish element in the blood of the common people today of weaker personality types. And that, as an explanation for the noble personality, that is how and why you find vanity so common in the modern world. That brings us to the end of section 261. We'll talk about section 262 in the next video. In section 262 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes of the emergence and development of different types or kinds, different species, and gives principles of what I will call social evolution. Under conditions of abundance, nature produces a great diversity of types, both good and bad, prodigies and monstrosities. Under leaner conditions, these surviving types are fewer. We might say that only when times are good does nature experiment. At other times, she rewards efficient adaptation. In human societies, it was the same way. Early societies were rigid and aristocratic precisely because the entire social group saw itself on the edge of extinction. Under these circumstances, there was little variation, no room for individual eccentricity. The qualities that helped the group survive were named the virtues of these societies: hardness, simplicity, uniformity, obedience. Every aristocratic morality is intolerant, writes Nietzsche. It is different under later conditions. When abundance comes, the old discipline is no longer necessary for the group's survival. Older moral forms and institutions might live on as luxuries, but their force is no longer felt. Variation appears, and we find individuals in such societies. The older morality bent the bow of human possibilities, storing up cultural energy, but it no longer restricts that energy's expression. Thus we find modern life characterized by a tropical tempo, a battle of savage egoisms. Society reaches the uncanny point of transcending the old morality, living beyond its boundaries. Nietzsche characterizes the flowering of such culture. There are no shared formulas any longer. Misunderstanding allied with disrespect, decay, corruption, and the highest desires gruesomely entangled, the genius of the race overflowing from all cornucopias of good and bad, a calamitous simultaneity of spring and fall, full of new charms and veils that characterize young, still unexhausted, still unwearied corruption. As corruption accelerates, the philosophers of such an age will see the end fast approaching, and from this recognition emerges a new morality, a morality of survival, a morality of mediocrity. But this new morality will not be able to declare itself openly. It will have to express itself in older moral language and concepts. It may never admit what it is and what it wants, writes Nietzsche. It must speak of measure and dignity and duty and neighbor love. It will find it difficult to conceal its irony. I think we see here the transition from master morality to slave morality in the transition from heroic aristocratic culture to modern democratic culture. And we see at the end a hint that modern moral forms will contain a new level of deception and self-deception. They will not do and say what they purport to do and say. Moral speech will always be suspected of irony. That brings us to the end of section 262. The next video is about section 263, instinct for rank and reverence. In section 263 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche discusses one of his core concepts, order of rank. As it is just one page long, we should read this section closely. There is an order of rank among human beings. Some are noble and some are base. The instinct for rank, which is also an instinct for reverence of what is noble and great, is a key marker of the higher type of man. Regarding the psychology of the noble soul, Nietzsche speaks of two events. First, the trial of seeing something or someone of high rank unprotected by authority and manners. Second, the process of testing and discovering a noble soul by testing its instinct for reverence, including self-reverence. For more on this, see section 287. Nietzsche also diagnoses the resentment of the base soul, which spurts up like dirty water at the sight of anything noble or sacred. This is ressentiment, another important concept in Nietzsche's philosophy. Reverence for high rank is a matter of feeling, not reasoning. It issues in a suppression of self, restraint in the presence of holy objects. Nietzsche says it is the product of centuries of tyrannical authority, protecting such things from popular hands. It is possible to train the masses in reverence. The lasting public reverence for the Bible, he says, is perhaps the best bit of discipline and refinement of manners that Europe owes to Christianity. Among his contemporaries, Nietzsche finds more to admire in the lower classes, whom centuries of Christian culture have trained to keep their unclean hands off of holy things, than in the cultured elite with their haughty insolence. Here again we see Nietzsche criticizing the tacky bourgeois sophistication of people produced by the modern education system. I'll finish with a quote from the end of this section. Perhaps there is nothing about so-called educated people and believers in modern ideas that is as nauseous as their lack of modesty and the comfortable insolence of their eyes and hands with which they touch, lick, and finger everything. And it is possible that even among the common people, among the less educated, especially among peasants, one finds today more relative nobility of taste and tactful reverence than among the newspaper-reading demimonde of the spirit, the educated. In Part 9, Section 264 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche discusses the influence that our ancestors, that our genetic inheritance will have on us, and he strikes here, I think, another Lamarckian note. That is, he gives expression again to what I've referred to as his Lamarckism, his adherence to a, I think, discredited 19th century view that acquired traits and knowledge are inheritable, can be passed down genetically from parents to children. He asserts here that the actions and habits of our ancestors will carry down into later generations. He writes quite explicitly, it is simply not possible that a human being should not have the qualities and preferences of his parents and ancestors in his body. This is the problem of race, he writes. Now, even allowing that by race he means something closer to what we might call nationality or ethnicity, tribe, this is a passage with some very ugly implications. Nietzsche does write about what he thinks are some of the main characteristics of the plebeian type of person, the corrupted blood, the certainty that one is correct. These, he thinks, mark a certain type of person, meaning not just a sort of psychological type, but also something of a natural biological type. Tying this in with his previous critiques of education, he does argue here that modern education is, in a popular sense, nothing more than a kind of inculcated self-deception about one's racial biological type. That is, education for plebeians now in modern democratic Europe is simply a matter of convincing plebeians that they are not plebeians. It is giving them a kind of false self-concept that they come from something other than and are something other than what they are. Overall, I think a fairly ugly section, and there's only so much one can do to try to save Nietzsche from the obvious terrible implications of what he's saying. In the following section, Nietzsche talks about the egoism of the noble soul. The noble soul is characterized by an unshakable faith that lower types of humanity are subordinate to it by nature. And one of the marks of nobility is the acceptance of this fact, this order of rank in the realm of the spirit and of nature, without any type of guilty conscience, any need for argument or explanation. The noble soul, he says, honors its equals not because it feels obligated or recognizes any kind of rule that it must follow, but because it sees in them the image of itself. And so in honoring them, it honors itself. Is a very important way in which it seems all praise given by the noble spirit is self-praise, refracted perhaps through a recognized peer or equal. The noble spirit does not look up, but rather forward. It knows itself to be at a spiritual height, says Nietzsche. There followed two very brief sections, a one-line quote from Goethe about giving respect to those who do not seek themselves, indicating, I think, those who already possess themselves. If one is seeking oneself, then one is somehow incomplete. And what he asserts to be a Chinese proverb about making your heart small, making your soul small. Self-diminution, Nietzsche says, is a characteristic of an exhausted and declining civilization. So perhaps China in a previous time, and in Nietzsche's own time, modern democratic Europe, and specifically Germany. In section 268, he takes up the question of what is common. Common here meaning first the opposite of noble, since this part 9 is about what is noble. What in the end is common? Nietzsche plays here on a verbal ambiguity, which is present in German as well as in English, where common can mean what is shared and what is widespread among many, and can also mean what is vulgar, what is low and base. So he begins by noting that simply understanding language for the purposes of social cooperation requires that we hold meaning in common, that we all agree upon and share a common understanding of words. From here, he moves on to say that it is the shared experiences of a group in struggling against its environment that forms a people, and a people is able to understand itself through its legacy of shared experiences more than outsiders, even if they all speak the same language. So this is the source of the social bond, the common source of the social bond, also a source of friendship, having similar reactions and similar feelings. I could not be friends with someone who I thought had profoundly opposite emotional reactions to circumstances from my own. Furthermore, the dominant pattern of reactions within a group of people determines its order of rank. We might say an order of rank of individuals, the high and the low, and also the order of rank of its values, of its dominant drives. This is what gives the sort of national character to a group of people. But this fact of the common also gives the advantage to ordinary types of self, of personality, those who best and fastest grasp the average and common experiences of all people have a sort of advantage. We might say there's a sort of built-in evolutionary advantage to the mediocre and to the normal, to the common. So to be uncommon, to be noble, to be exceptional requires a countervailing force. It requires something that comes not from the common but from somewhere else, perhaps from within one's own sense of will and greatness or some natural gift, to overcome this sort of natural social drift towards the common and the advantages of the common. Section 269 is, I think, like some other sections late in Part 9, autobiographical as well as informative and observational. Nietzsche tells us about the psychologist and the chief danger of the modern psychologist, which is the phenomenon of pity. And I think he's talking here about himself as much as about the psychologist in general. So the psychologist, in looking into human character, needs, Nietzsche says, hardness and cheerfulness more than anyone else in the human race, because he is in constant danger of succumbing to pity. His knowledge of what man is, of what humanity is like, is in danger of overwhelming him. If he is overwhelmed by pity, he may turn against his own class, his own type of noble, higher spirit, and engage in a kind of self-destruction. Part of the therapy that the psychologist then imposes upon himself might be a kind of escape into the everyday activities, escape from his memory of what man is like. There's a way in which the psychologist acquires this knowledge at great price and at great suffering, and then the memory of the knowledge of what man is like is a sort of constant threat to his own mental health and mental stability. Nietzsche ends this section by discussing the way in which women and Christianity both are sources of danger for the psychologist and for the artist who looks into the human spirit and sees just what is there. Both of these are sources of pity and falsehood and ultimately the danger of self-destruction for the psychologist. The next 8 sections deal with, in different ways, with contrasts between noble and base characters. Nietzsche jumps around a little bit talking about different qualities that we find in the noble self. One of these is a capacity for profound suffering. The noble spirit is able to suffer as few others are able to. We might think of the contrast here with the last man, who is, we're told, unable even to despise himself, unable to suffer in any important way because his sense of self and his sense of what is important is so shallow. Because the noble spirit is capable of such great suffering, he wears a variety of disguises. He might wear the disguise of cheerfulness or of scientific objectivity or of folly. These are all masks, sometimes even double or triple masks, that the psychologist, the noble spirit, has to wear in public. Nietzsche also says that noble souls, on confronting each other, will respect the mask. They will not probe too deeply into another's deception, another's public persona. People who have read Kierkegaard might helpfully contrast this with Kierkegaard's idea of the knights of faith, who pass each other without recognition. Another characteristic of the noble soul is a sense of cleanliness, and I think this is meant spiritually more than physically. He says the loftiness of the saints is the spiritualization of this cleanliness instinct, this desire to overcome the kind of filth of humanity, to rise above it. The saint's pity, he writes, is pity with the dirt of what is human, all too human. So this desire to get away from or to overcome, to endure the stench of mankind. Another mark of the noble spirit is that he holds his duties to be personal rather than universal. He does not generalize his duties or his obligations. This even is a kind of temptation for the noble person that he resists, that he sees, because he knows his values
to come from within himself, he does not fall prey to the desire to make his obligations the obligations of all people. He speaks solely in the first person, we might say, when he makes his moral judgments. The noble spirit is also the one who acts at the right time, in contrast with awaking too late. In fact, Nietzsche suggests that perhaps genius is common in the world, but timely genius is what's rare. For the noble spirit, there is a greater danger and a greater likelihood of ruin. He runs more risks. Again, the contrast with the last man is helpful. And the noble self may realize at the end of his life that he has learned something that he needed to know at the beginning. Nietzsche calls this the eternal, distasteful, too late, the sort of tragic recognition that one does not have. One has only lately acquired the knowledge that one really needed much earlier. There are some personal reflections towards the end of this section of Part 9. Nietzsche has a nice image where he speaks of the question of going back, and he says, well, one also goes back when one is preparing to take a huge leap. Some of these also, I think, these observations are also, I think, autobiographical. He speaks of the self-control of praising only people with whom you disagree, and how this then creates a certain kind of false expectation in the observers of the great man. And great thoughts, he says, are always understood last, like light from a distant star, like the light from a supernova that happened thousands of years ago, finally reaching us on Earth. This is, again, a sort of characteristic part of the ethos of the great man. In section 287, Nietzsche takes up explicitly the question of what is noble? What does the word noble mean now, today, in a plebeian age? And he plays a little bit off of the Christian distinction between acts and works, and he says it's not noble actions, it's not the works of nobility that constitute the noble person. Rather, it's something more like faith, some kind of inner certainty, inner quality of the noble soul. And he emphasizes this, a good formula for the nobility of soul. The noble soul has reverence for itself. It possesses itself in a way that makes it capable of holding itself, assigning itself that kind of importance. I might think here again of the passage from The Gay Science in which the madman says, we must become gods in order to be worthy of having brought about the death of God. Perhaps the noble spirit is the one who has successfully stepped into that empty, God-shaped hole in the cosmos, and who is now capable of feeling reverence for himself in some critical way that is not present in lower types of human self. In sections 289 and beyond, Nietzsche makes some interesting observations about philosophy, and I think this may provide us with a kind of interpretive key to some of his own work as we come to the end of this book. No philosopher, he says, ever writes his final philosophy in books. Okay, shades of Plato's seventh letter here. Or, as he puts it, beyond every cave there is a still deeper cave, perhaps again invoking Plato. Every philosophy is a foreground philosophy. Every philosophy also conceals a philosophy. So the suggestion, I think, here for us, coming towards the end of Beyond Good and Evil, is that there's a great deal more to Nietzsche's thought than what is present here in the book. What we have here is only a starting point, a place for further exploration. The great thinkers of the world always fear being misunderstood, but they perhaps even more so fear being understood, because the former will sting their vanity, but the latter will sting their heart. To be understood is to share one's own suffering, the suffering that one's knowledge brings with others. So this brings us to the end of section 292. The next video will look at section 293. Three things stand out about section 293 of Beyond Good and Evil: Nietzsche's portrait of the masterful man, his remarks on the value of pity, and his assertion that European culture is becoming a veritable cult of suffering. In this video, I will comment on each of these three elements, then give you the text of section 293. Nietzsche describes the man who is by nature a master in a long, rambling sentence. The masterful man declares and protects his own people, his own goods and homeland. He is able to act decisively,
to keep promises, to rebuke those who slight him. His strength is a refuge for weaker spirits who seek him out for protection. Kaufmann remarks that the German expression Nietzsche uses is gern zu fallen, the weak like to fall, up to or under the master. I think this sort of description is valuable, both for its vivid and evocative details and for its insight into Nietzsche's personal psychology. This sort of strength, the manly power that protects the weak, claiming them for one's own, is something he finds valuable and finds lacking in contemporary Europe. We may find it worthwhile to look elsewhere for more signs of Nietzsche's personal investment in this vision of the masterful man. The long description of the master by nature ends by noting that such a man's pity is really worth something. Recall that pity is one of the deadly emotions for Nietzsche. It undermines and weakens almost everything it touches. Elsewhere in his works, Nietzsche warns against the dangers of pity. Here, pity means a sympathetic concern for the weak and downtrodden. The pity of the strong man is worth paying attention to, he says, unlike the pity of the weak, which is self-serving. And worse, the pity of those who preach pity, who make pity into an ideology or a worldview. This is what Nietzsche accuses Christianity of doing, and he thinks it is deadly to the higher ambitions of the human spirit. We can think of Nietzsche's large-scale moral project as an overcoming of the morality of pity. But why is the strong man's pity worthwhile? Because it proceeds from his unshakable strength of will, his knowledge that he himself is its source. A weaker man might feel pity out of a sense of obligation, in response to an external demand, perhaps out of obedience to God's law. This pity, Nietzsche thinks, is useless or worse. He remorselessly criticizes pity as a system or an external obligation. In the second half of section 293, Nietzsche observes that late 19th century Europe is afflicted by a pathological sensitivity and receptivity to pain, a repulsive incontinence in lamentation, and a veritable cult of suffering, which he denounces as unmanly and in bad taste. Three aspects of this passage deserve attention: Nietzsche's diagnosis, criticism, and solution. First, his diagnosis. Nietzsche seems to think Europeans value suffering over strength, even to the point of assigning higher social value to those who have suffered more. He associates this sensibility with Christianity and modern egalitarianism and social democracy. Second, his criticism of this culture of victimhood. He calls it unmanly and incompatible with the willfulness and self-assertion of the masterful man. Each of these aspects is open to challenge. We will discuss his diagnostic and evaluative claims further in class or in the comment section below. Lastly, Nietzsche suggests that the solution to this pity sickness of European culture is his gay science, joyful wisdom, or fröhliche Wissenschaft. This is the title of an earlier book of his, in which he first introduces the expression God is dead. So we should see Nietzsche's philosophy as containing a prospective solution to the cult of suffering he disdains. We will see different elements of this solution as we read further into Nietzsche's works. Now, here's the text of section 293 of Beyond Good and Evil.
A man who says, "I like this, I take this for my own and want to protect it and defend it against anybody." A man who is able to manage something, to carry out a resolution, to remain faithful to a thought, to hold a woman, to punish and prostrate one who presumed too much. A man who has his wrath and his sword, and to whom the weak, the suffering, the hard-pressed, and the animals too, like to come and belong by nature. In short, a man who is by nature a master. When such a man has pity, well, this pity has value. But what good is the pity of those who suffer, or those who, worse, preach pity? Almost everywhere in Europe today we find a pathological sensitivity and receptivity to pain, also a repulsive incontinence in lamentation, an increase in tenderness that would use religion and philosophical bric-a-brac to deck itself out as something higher. There is a veritable cult of suffering.
The unmanliness of what is baptized as pity in the circles of such enthusiasts is, I should think, what always meets the eye first. This newest kind of bad taste should be exorcised vigorously and thoroughly, and I finally wish that one might place around one's heart and neck the good amulet, Gai Saber, gay science, to make it plain to the plain.
Section 294 of Beyond Good and Evil is short but important, I think. In it, Nietzsche attacks Hobbes and the English generally for being anti-laughter. He assigns a quote to Hobbes, which may or may not be in Hobbes' work, and he uses it to critique the grotesque seriousness of English philosophy and of Christianity in general. He goes on to suggest an order of rank among philosophers. He says, we may be able to classify philosophers according to their capacity for laughter, all the way up to those capable of golden laughter, a sense in which, for Nietzsche, the better a philosopher is, the stronger his spirit is, the more capable he is of a higher and purer kind of laughter. He adds also that if the gods were to philosophize, then they too would be able to laugh, which suggests an interesting connection between philosophy and the capacity for laughter. And, he says, critically, their laughter would be new and superhuman. It would be unfamiliar to us. It would be something beyond human laughter. I think the overall purpose of this section is to contrast Nietzsche's life-affirming philosophy with the heavy, plodding seriousness of other philosophies of Christianity as he conceives of it, and maybe also, we would say, of the English as a people. Section 295, the penultimate section of the book, begins with a lengthy and, I think, very eloquent portrait of the genius of the heart. Nietzsche speaks of this new character quite movingly, and we begin by wondering who is this genius of the heart? What is the character who possesses this unique genius and power? Is it Socrates? Is it Nietzsche? Is it the philosopher of the future who's been spoken of earlier? Nietzsche refers to this character as the tempter god, as the Pied Piper of consciences, leading people away, binding people closer to him. The genius is the master of seeming and also of discernment and of manipulation. He's able to change people in certain ways and draw them closer to himself. He teaches what is loud and self-satisfied, I think both individuals and also parts of our souls. He teaches the loud how to listen, and he smooths over what is rough. He teaches us patience and stillness and allows us to plumb the hidden depths of our souls, and from him everyone walks away richer in self-knowledge. I think at the end of this video I will read this paragraph for you so you can hear just what Nietzsche says about this crucial figure. In the remainder of section 295, Nietzsche reveals to us that this figure he has been describing, this genius of the heart, is the god Dionysius, reconceived by Nietzsche as a philosopher, as a philosophical figure or a philosopher god, a god of the philosophers perhaps. He refers to himself as the last disciple and initiate of the god Dionysius. There's certainly a fair amount of theater in Nietzsche's self-presentation here at the end of this book. He says we may be suspicious of this new god, of this new philosopher. We may be offended by his suggestion that this is the new inspiration. He notes that we might praise, if he were so inclined, might praise Dionysius for his honesty and his truthfulness and love of wisdom, but says that the god Dionysius disdains human praise and would say, I have no need to cover my nakedness. We would just take him as he is. The god Dionysius, Nietzsche goes on to say, would praise man, the man of today perhaps, as inventive and courageous, and the god says, I would make of man something stronger, more evil, and more profound. Also, he says, more beautiful. And this is where the section leaves off. What are we to make of this idea of the god Dionysius here at the end of the book as a philosopher, as a philosophical figure, perhaps the type of god capable of this new and higher divine type of laughter? Well, it's plain that this is a being, a divinity that goes beyond the human and beyond the human categories of good and evil that have been the subject of the study in this book, and especially in Part 9. We have here an alternative to the Platonic and Christian divinities that Nietzsche has inherited philosophically, and the moralities that go along with them. We have the divine reconceived in the mode of a tempter or a trickster or an experimenter. And I think we have here a god, a divinity that is both more than human and perhaps we might say also the creation of the human. In fact, the very last sentence of section 295, Nietzsche writes, "There are other good reasons for conjecturing that in several respects all of the gods could learn from us humans, for we humans are more humane, more human." In German, wir Menschen sind menschlicher. So I think in a sense the god Dionysius as philosopher is a realization of Nietzsche's ambition for some kind of replacement for the Christian God. It is a God that stands in a philosophical sense beyond the human. It is beyond good and evil, and I think it may be the God of the inspiration and creativity of this new type of philosopher, this new type of human being, this philosopher of the future that Nietzsche speaks of throughout this work. So I think that's one place that we can see this kind of dramatic and surprising invocation of the new philosopher Dionysius as an inspiring figure here at the end of the book. That brings us to the end of section 295. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching today. Now, as I promised, I'll read to you the first paragraph of section 295. Here we go. "The genius of the heart, as that great concealed one possesses it, the tempter god, and born Pied Piper of consciences, whose voice knows how to descend into the netherworld of every soul, who does not say a word or cast a glance in which there is no consideration and ulterior enticement, whose mastery includes the knowledge of how to seem, not what he is, but what is to those who follow him one more constraint to press ever closer to him in order to follow him ever more inwardly and thoroughly. The genius of the heart who silences all that is loud and self-satisfied, teaching it to listen, who smooths rough souls and lets them taste a new desire, to lie still as a mirror, that the deep sky may mirror itself in them. The genius of the heart who teaches the doltish and rash hand to hesitate and reach out more delicately, who guesses the concealed and forgotten treasure, the drop of graciousness and sweet spirituality under dim and thick ice, and is a divining rod for every grain of gold that has long lain buried in the dungeon of much mud and sand. The genius of the heart from whose touch everyone walks away richer, not having received grace, and surprised not as blessed and oppressed by alien goods, but richer in himself, newer to himself than before, broken open, blown at and sounded out by a thawing wind, perhaps more unsure, tenderer, more fragile, more broken, but full of hopes that as yet have no name, full of new will and currents, full of new dissatisfaction and undertows." Beyond Good and Evil ends with a short section of Nietzsche addressing a farewell to his own thoughts. He addresses his thoughts in parting and notes that formerly at the beginning they were colorful, they were young, they were malicious, and now he sees them grown up, mature, they've become immortal, they've become decent, they've become dull. And he says, some of you, I fear, are ready to become truths.
And there's this interesting contrast between the kind of fixedness and boringness of truth, as Nietzsche has redefined it, and the high energy and mystery and of the sort of pre-truth thoughts out of which he has composed this book. It was always so, says Nietzsche, for we mandarins of the spirit, we with our Chinese brushes, for thinkers who work on the edge of what can be said, who try to grasp thoughts that are on the edge of passing away, because only then, at the very end of their life, can they be caught by human minds and immortalized in words, a bit like a falling star about to be extinguished as it hits the ground. No one, says Nietzsche, will ever guess how these thoughts looked in the morning of their youth, in the full glory of their energy and initiation. As I said in the previous video, part of the indication here is that the value of Nietzsche's philosophy is not to be found in the doctrines that it teaches, in the particular philosophical positions that it defends with arguments or that it asserts. Nietzsche suggests a need to look further, to look for what could not be said, to look what maybe lies beyond language and thought. So we have here in this final section, I think, a suggestion, first, of a contrast between what is here in the book that we've just finished reading and what is not here, but what could perhaps be accessed, perhaps by some philosopher of the future. And there's a suggestion, I think, also of this deep reservoir of energy behind this book, something that is prior to truth, as Nietzsche has defined it here, some kind of deep reservoir of energy, connection to which will seem to be a standard for any philosophy of the future, which would be meaningful. And so I think part of the suggestion here to Nietzsche's most astute readers is the need for them to go beyond, to explore and to create in a way that is not bound by the text that Nietzsche has given to us. So that's my discussion of section 296, the final section of Beyond Good and Evil. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.